rain had not stopped for 3 days in Saint-Martin-de-Rivière, a sleepy French village where gossip was currency and strangers were regarded with polite suspicion. The streets were narrow and slick with water, the stone cottages huddled close as though trying to keep each other warm. It was in such weather that the terrible business occurred at Madame Morel's boarding house, a crime so peculiar that even the local gendarmerie, practical men accustomed to the occasional drunken brawl or petty theft, were left at a loss. The boarding house itself was an old, elegant building on the edge of the village square, with high, shuttered windows and ivy creeping along its facade. Madame Morel, a widow of considerable charm and more considerable will, ran it with brisk efficiency, catering to a mix of travelling merchants, the occasional city writer seeking solitude, and Father Benoit, the parish priest, who had taken up a modest suite on the second floor while repairs were made to the rectory. On the third morning of rain, Madame Morel burst into the sitting-room, pale as the linen tablecloths she so fastidiously maintained. "He's gone," she whispered to no one in particular, clutching at the doorframe. Her eyes darted toward the stairs. "Father Benoit. His room is locked from the inside." Within the hour, half the village had gathered on the square, staring up at the shuttered windows like they might open and offer an explanation. Sergeant Duval, the stocky village policeman, pounded on the door to no avail. It was eventually decided to fetch the locksmith, but before he could arrive, Duval ordered the door forced open. Inside, the air was close and smelled faintly of incense. Father Benoit's bed was unmade, his cassock hung neatly on the wardrobe door, but the man himself was nowhere to be seen. On the desk lay his Bible, closed, and beside it a small brass crucifix that had been snapped clean in half. There was no sign of struggle, no open window, and the only door had been locked from within. The rain had stopped briefly as though the sky itself were listening. The strangest thing, however, was found on the nightstand, a single playing card, the Queen of Spades, placed face up. No one could say what it meant. Father Benoit was not known to gamble. Indeed, he had once given a sermon against the moral corruption of games of chance. Sergeant Duval scratched his head. "No blood, no footprints, no broken glass," he muttered. "And no priest. How does a man leave a locked room without leaving the room?" Madame Morel wrung her hands. "He would not leave without telling me, and never in such secrecy." For the next 2 days the gendarmerie searched the village and the surrounding countryside. The river was dredged, abandoned barns were combed through, and every traveller in and out of Saint-Martin-de-Rivière was questioned. Father Benoit had simply vanished, leaving only that broken crucifix and the playing card behind. It was on the afternoon of the second day that Miss Jane Marple, staying at the boarding house for a quiet holiday on the advice of her doctor, found herself drawn into the matter. She had kept politely to the background while the fuss was at its height, knitting by the fire and listening to the chatter of guests and villagers alike. But she had been listening very carefully indeed. She had noticed, for instance, that Madame Morel, normally brisk and efficient, had been unusually flustered whenever the Queen of Spades was mentioned. She had also observed that the housemaid Yvette had red-rimmed eyes not entirely attributable to sorrow over the missing priest, and she remembered, though no one else seemed to, that the night before the disappearance there had been a small gathering in the parlour where Father Benoit had excused himself early, complaining of a headache. Miss Marple decided to speak with Madame Morel privately. They sat in the parlour, the rain pattering softly against the windows once more. "You seem troubled, Madame Morel," Miss Marple began in her gentle, deceptively mild tone. "More troubled than one might expect, even under such circumstances." The widow's hands, folded in her lap, tightened slightly. "I am merely concerned for Father Benoit. He was a good man." "Yet you hesitate before saying so," Miss Marple observed. "You have the look of someone guarding a secret, and I do not think it is your own." Madame Morel's eyes flickered. "You are very perceptive, Mademoiselle Marple. But the police, they would not understand. They would think ill of him." "And you do not wish that?" "No." Madame Morel looked away, her voice lowering. "Father Benoit received a letter 3 days ago. I did not read it, of course, but I saw the handwriting, a woman's hand, and when he finished reading it, he looked afraid. Truly afraid. He burned the letter immediately in the fireplace." This was interesting indeed. Miss Marple considered the fact in silence, her needles clicking steadily. "And the card?" she asked at last. Madame Morel shook her head quickly. "I have no idea. None." But there was something in the quickness of her denial that suggested she knew more than she cared to admit. That night, Miss Marple found herself wandering the second-floor corridor, her steps soft on the old rugs. She paused before Father Benoit's room, the door now unlatched. Inside, she examined the scene with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. The crucifix lay where it had been, the break clean and deliberate rather than accidental. The Queen of Spades was still on the nightstand, though its position had shifted slightly, as though someone had moved it and replaced it without care. Her eyes moved to the window, closed and latched. She ran her fingers along the frame. No scratches, no tampering. Then she noticed something odd. On the floor, beneath the window, the faint outline of damp shoe prints, one complete, one partial, almost entirely dried, but still just visible in the lamplight. Whoever had stood there had done so before the room was locked. The next morning, Sergeant Duval declared the matter beyond his capacity and sent a wire to Paris. But it was Miss Marple, sipping her tea in the corner, who quietly asked the most important question of all. If Father Benoit left no trace, she murmured, then perhaps it was never he who locked that door at all. The thought hung in the air, heavy with implication. Somewhere in Saint-Martin-de-Rivière, someone knew the truth about the missing priest, and Miss Marple intended to find them. Miss Marple had always believed that people told you far more than they realized, provided you gave them space to do it. In her experience, the most revealing clues often came not from grand gestures or confessions, but from small, seemingly trivial things, the tilt of a head, the hesitation before an answer, the way fingers fussed over a teacup. And in Madame Morel's boarding house, those small things were beginning to take shape into something larger. The morning after Sergeant Duval wired Paris, the air in the sitting room was tense. Guests clustered in little knots, speaking in low voices, glancing toward the door as if they half expected Father Benoit to walk in. Madame Morel busied herself arranging flowers in a vase, her movements overly brisk, as though the act might banish her thoughts. Yvette moved from chair to chair with a dustcloth, but her eyes never stopped flicking toward the staircase. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in her armchair, caught these glances and stored them away. There was a strange undercurrent in the house now, something unspoken, like a shared worry no one dared voice aloud. The police had scoured the grounds again at first light, but their search had yielded nothing new. They were operating under the comfortable assumption that Father Benoit had either run away or come to harm outside the village, which meant their focus was already drifting elsewhere. It was precisely in these moments, Miss Marple knew, that the truth liked to hide in plain sight. After the gendarmes departed, she asked Yvette if she might bring her another cup of tea. The girl complied, but as she set the cup down, her sleeve caught on the edge of the side table. Something clattered to the floor. It was a brass key, old and slightly tarnished, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. Yvette snatched it up quickly, almost too quickly. "Careful, mademoiselle," she said, forcing a smile. "It belongs to Madame Morel. I was to return it to her." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the key for a moment longer than politeness required. "Indeed, a useful key, no doubt." Yvette flushed. "It is for the storeroom." And with that, she hurried away. It was the haste that caught Miss Marple's attention, not just the swiftness of Yvette's movements, but the subtle tightening of her shoulders, as though she had been caught in some private act. She did not, however, call the girl back. Better to let her think the moment forgotten. Later that afternoon, Madame Morel appeared at Miss Marple's armchair, her smile tight but determined. "I am taking a tray to Monsieur Bouchard," she announced as if to an audience. "He has a touch of fever." Miss Marple murmured a polite response, but her thoughts pricked at the name. Monsieur Bouchard was a merchant from Lyon, recently arrived, a man of florid complexion, fond of long, loud stories, and, Miss Marple had noticed, equally fond of card games. She had once seen him shuffling a deck with easy familiarity in the parlour, the cards slipping through his fingers like water, and she could not help but recall the Queen of Spades lying beside Father Benoit's Bible. That evening, when most of the guests had retired, Miss Marple found herself in the parlour with Monsieur Bouchard. The merchant was seated by the fire, polishing his spectacles. She took a seat opposite him, her knitting in hand. "You must find the rain troublesome for your business," she began. "Ah, but it gives one time to rest," Bouchard replied amiably. "A good hand of cards, a warm fire, a glass of wine, that is enough for me." "A hand of cards," Miss Marple repeated mildly. "I imagine you play very well," he chuckled. "I'm not without skill, madame, but here there is little opportunity. The priest, for instance, pah! He would not touch them, said the cards were the devil's tools." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "And yet one of them was found in his room. The Queen of Spades." Bouchard froze for just a fraction of a second before recovering his genial expression. "Ah, the police told you. Strange, very strange. But perhaps a joke? Or a warning? Who can say?" She did not press him, but she noted the quick dart of his eyes toward the doorway before he changed the subject. That flicker of unease told her what his words did not. He knew more about that card than he cared to admit. The following morning brought another oddity. Madame Morel announced that certain food supplies had gone missing from the storeroom. Bread, cheese, a bottle of wine. The theft had occurred during the night, though no one had seen or heard a thing. Yvette insisted she had locked the storeroom door before retiring, but when Sergeant Duval inspected it, the lock showed no sign of tampering. Miss Marple thought again of the key that had slipped from Yvette's sleeve. "A key to the storeroom," she had said. Yet if that were true, how had the food vanished without Yvette's knowledge? Or had it vanished precisely with her knowledge? In the late afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk about the grounds. The rain had eased to a fine mist, and the air smelled of damp earth. Behind the boarding-house lay the garden, overgrown and wild in places, with a narrow path leading toward the small stone outbuilding that served as the storeroom. Its door was firmly shut, the lock secure. But as she stood there, she noticed something curious. A thin trail of breadcrumbs leading away from the door and vanishing into the hedge. Miss Marple followed the trail with patient steps, stooping occasionally to peer more closely. The crumbs led her through the hedge and into a small copse of trees at the far edge of the property. There, half hidden beneath a heap of fallen branches, she saw the faint outline of a tarp, damp and weighted with stones. She did not disturb it, but she studied its shape. Long, narrow, large enough perhaps to conceal a person. When she returned to the house, her thoughts were no longer clouded by uncertainty. Someone in Madame Morel's boarding-house knew exactly where Father Benoit was, and had been keeping him hidden. The missing food, the secretive key, the broken crucifix, the playing card, each detail was beginning to point toward a carefully constructed deception. And though the picture was not yet complete, Miss Marple had the distinct sense that the Queen of Spades was far more than a whimsical clue. It was a message, one meant for someone in this very house. She resolved to wait, to watch, and to let the guilty hand reveal itself. They always did, in the end. The next morning dawned grey and listless, the mist curling low over the village square like a shroud. Inside Madame Morel's boarding-house, the fire had been stoked early, the air thick with the scent of burning wood. Guests moved about quietly, but the hush was not one of mourning. It was the nervous quiet of people who knew something was wrong but did not yet know the shape of it. Miss Marple sat in her armchair near the hearth, knitting as steadily as the tick of the mantel clock. Her eyes moved between the faces in the room, reading their expressions as she might read the pages of a book. Today, she intended to turn the conversation ever so slightly in ways that would let the truth leak out. It was Madame Morel she approached first. The widow stood by the window, her hands resting lightly on the sill, watching the square below. "A troubling matter, this," Miss Marple began, her tone sympathetic. Madame Morel sighed. "Troubling? It is unbearable, mademoiselle, to have such a thing happen under my roof. I cannot sleep for thinking of it." "Of course. And yet you continue with the daily running of the house most admirably," Miss Marple observed, "even keeping Monsieur Bouchard supplied with meals during his indisposition." Madame Morel's eyes flickered. "It is my duty. The poor man is unwell, and I am not in the habit of letting guests suffer." "But the storeroom theft," Miss Marple said gently. "That must be difficult, supplies disappearing in such a way." "Yvette should have locked it better," Madame Morel replied quickly. then glanced toward the maid with a note of disapproval. "She is careless." A faint, interesting note of irritation. It might be genuine, or it might be a deliberate shifting of suspicion. Miss Marple stored it away. Next was Yvette herself. The girl was folding linens in the corner, her movements quick but oddly tense, as though her mind was elsewhere. Miss Marple joined her, smoothing the corner of a sheet with practised precision. "A tiresome business, all this searching," she said. "Yes, mademoiselle," Yvette murmured. "You have been with Madame Morel long?" 2 years. "And Father Benoit, he was a good lodger?" The girl hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, quiet, kind enough. But not friendly, not overly so. He kept to himself." Miss Marple kept her voice light. "I imagine you rarely saw him with cards." This time Yvette's head jerked up, her eyes darting toward the doorway before she answered. "Never, never once." "Strange, then, that such a card should be found in his room," Miss Marple said softly. Yvette's fingers tightened on the linen. "I don't know anything about it," but she said it too quickly, and with the same strained tone Madame Morel had used the previous day. After luncheon, Miss Marple found Monsieur Bouchard seated in the parlour, bundled in a shawl, looking far too robust for a man supposedly suffering from fever. She took the chair opposite him. "You seem improved," she remarked mildly. He puffed out his chest. "Ah, yes, a little rest, some wine. Nothing like Lyonnais constitution, eh?" "I'm glad," Miss Marple said, "though I imagine the disappearance has unsettled you." "Of course, such a thing. It is a disgrace." "And yet, you were one of the last to see Father Benoit alive, were you not? The night before he vanished?" Bouchard's brows rose. "Perhaps. We spoke a little. Nothing of importance." "Not about cards?" He gave a short laugh. "The priest!" Never. He would not have entertained such a topic. It was nearly the same line Yvette had used, and with the same too certain emphasis. Miss Marple's needles clicked in her lap. She made one last call that afternoon, to Etienne, the stable boy, who had been asked to fetch coal from the yard on the morning Father Benoit was found missing. He was a wiry lad with a mop of dark hair, and a manner too quick to please. "I hear you're quite the early riser," Miss Marple began, smiling. "Always, mademoiselle. Horses don't feed themselves." "And the morning of the priest's disappearance, you saw nothing unusual?" Etienne shifted his weight. "No, mademoiselle, nothing at all." "But you went past the storeroom?" "Yes, it was locked." "You're sure?" "Positive. I even heard Madame Morel in the kitchen. She was talking to someone. I think it was Monsieur Bouchard." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. That was curious. Bouchard had claimed to be in his room that morning with a fever. If Etienne spoke truth, then Bouchard had already lied. She left the boy and went to sit quietly by the fire, piecing together the fragments. Madame Morel shifting blame to Yvette, Yvette echoing Bouchard's denial about the cards, Bouchard lying about his whereabouts. Each story overlapped in certain details, yet contradicted in others, like fabric stitched together from mismatched cloth. The contradictions were small enough to pass unnoticed by the gendarmes, but to Miss Marple they were as telling as a shout. Someone in this house was trying very hard to keep the picture neat, and in doing so had made the edges ragged. It was no longer simply about a vanished priest. It was about lies spoken in calm voices, about secrets exchanged in hallways, about the strange and silent weight of the Queen of Spades. Miss Marple decided the time was coming to pull at one of those ragged edges and see just how much of the fabric would come undone. The rain had returned by nightfall, a steady drumming on the shutters that seemed to drive the guests closer to the fire. The parlour at Madame Morel's was warm, but the mood was far from cosy. There was an unease in the air, as though each person felt the invisible threads drawing tighter around them. Miss Marple, settled in her usual armchair, appeared entirely absorbed in her knitting. In truth, she was sifting through the conversations of the past 2 days, weighing every contradiction, every hurried glance against what she knew of human nature. The problem was not the absence of motives. There were too many. It was that none of them, alone, fit the whole picture. Madame Morel, for instance, had more to lose than anyone. Her boarding house had a spotless reputation, and a scandal of this magnitude could ruin her. If she knew something about Father Benoit's disappearance, if perhaps she had even helped arrange it, she might be acting out of fear for her livelihood. Yet fear alone did not explain the playing card, nor the broken crucifix. Those details spoke of something more personal. Yvette was another puzzle. The maid's nervousness could be the ordinary fear of being accused, but Miss Marple suspected there was more. The matter of the storeroom key lingered in her mind. If Yvette had helped supply food to someone in hiding, it might be from loyalty or from coercion. And loyalty raised its own questions: to whom and why? Then there was Monsieur Bouchard, whose easy charm hid a calculating streak. His denial of any link to the Queen of Spades was too rehearsed, his sudden illness too convenient. A man familiar with cards might use them to send a message, or to taunt. And Etienne's claim of seeing him in the kitchen on the morning of the disappearance suggested he was lying about more than his health. Even Etienne himself was not without motive. A stable boy knew the comings and goings of guests better than most, and such knowledge could be a valuable currency or a dangerous liability if someone else decided it was worth silencing. Miss Marple began to trace the lines between them in her mind. The Queen of Spades was the pivot point. In her experience, that card often carried connotations of deceit, betrayal, or a dangerous woman. She wondered if it had been meant for Father Benoit at all, or for someone who would understand its significance. The alibis, such as they were, did not reassure her. Madame Morel claimed to have been in her private sitting room when the priest vanished. Yvette said she was upstairs preparing rooms. Bouchard was supposedly in bed with a fever. Etienne was tending to the coal yard. Yet each alibi depended on another person's word or on no witness at all. She turned her thoughts to the broken crucifix. A deliberate break, not an accident. Symbolic, perhaps, an act of anger or rejection. Could it be tied to the letter Madame Morel had seen Father Benoit burn? If that letter had been from a woman, as she believed, it might have contained something that shook the priest deeply. A confession, perhaps, or an accusation. But who could that woman be? Someone from his past? Or someone here in the village? If the latter, then the entire affair might be rooted in a private scandal rather than a public crime. And scandal, Miss Marple knew, could drive people to desperate measures, especially in small, tight-knit communities where gossip was poison. That evening she watched the interactions in the parlour with renewed interest. Madame Morel avoided Bouchard's gaze, though she spoke to him politely enough. Yvette was quick to serve Bouchard wine, but did not linger near him. Etienne hovered in the doorway, as if unsure whether to stay or go, his eyes darting from guest to guest. Miss Marple decided to probe more directly. She began with Bouchard, who had taken up residence in the armchair opposite her. "I wonder," she said, as if musing aloud, "what would make a man of the cloth break his own crucifix?" Bouchard chuckled without humour. Perhaps he found his faith no longer served him. "Or perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "someone else broke it for him. Someone who wished to make a point." He shrugged, but his eyes flicked toward Madame Morel before he spoke. "Points can be dangerous, madame, especially if they cut too deep." Later she approached Yvette in the kitchen. The girl was washing dishes, her sleeves rolled up. "Such a storm," Miss Marple said. "It must have been dreadful for Father Benoit to be caught out in such weather, if indeed he was." Yvette's hands stilled in the soapy water. "You think he's still alive?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that people sometimes go where they believe they must, whether it's safe or not." Yvette looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not everyone chooses for themselves, mademoiselle." Then she turned back to her work, ending the conversation. It was a small crack, but a revealing one. Someone had been controlling Yvette's actions, and she resented it. The final piece of the evening came when Miss Marple passed Etienne in the hallway. He stopped her with an awkward bow. "You think they will find him, mademoiselle?" "I think the truth will be found," she said. Etienne swallowed. Sometimes the truth is worse than not knowing. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Only for those with something to hide. By the time she retired that night, the threads of the puzzle were beginning to knot together. Greed could explain the theft of supplies, and perhaps Bouchard's interest in the matter. Fear could explain Madame Morel's guardedness. Jealousy might link to the mysterious letter, and to the Queen of Spades, if it referred to a woman at the heart of the matter. Revenge, however, was the thread she could not yet place. She suspected it would reveal itself soon enough. For in a web as tangled as this one, every thread was connected, and tugging the right one would bring the whole thing into the open. And Miss Marple had already decided which thread she meant to pull first. The rain finally broke at dawn, leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet stone and damp earth. Saint Martin de Rivière awoke to a brittle kind of optimism, the sort that clings to people when they believe the worst might finally be behind them. The source of that optimism came in the form of Sergeant Duval, who arrived at Madame Morel's with an air of triumph and a folded sheet of paper clutched in his hand. "Good news," he announced, his moustache quivering with self-satisfaction. "We have found the priest." The room stirred. Gasps from the guests, a sharp intake of breath from Madame Morel, the clatter of a dropped spoon from Yvette. "Alive?" Madame Morel asked, her voice almost cracking. Duval puffed up further. "Not alive, but found, in the riverbank reeds, 2 kilometres downstream. It appears he fell, struck his head on a rock. The current carried him there. Case closed." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "And how do you explain the locked room?" she asked mildly. Duval waved a dismissive hand. "He must have locked it himself before taking some way out through the window. Perhaps there was a loose shutter. These things happen. A window escape without damage to the latch, footprints that had all but dried when she first entered the room. Miss Marple knew it didn't add up, but she let him continue. "We also found this." Duval produced a small oilskin pouch from his coat. Inside was a folded letter, the ink smudged from water but still legible. It was addressed to Father Benoit in a looping feminine hand. Madame Morel went pale. "Go on," Duval said with a hint of relish. Read it aloud. She shook her head, but Bouchard stepped forward and plucked it from Duval's fingers. His voice carried across the room. "Benoit, I cannot forgive what you have done. By the time you read this, it will be too late to undo it. You will pay for your betrayal." Bouchard let out a low whistle. A lady's wrath, eh? No wonder he ran into the night. The gendarme closed his little performance with a flourish. "So you see, a guilty conscience. Suicide, perhaps accidental death. Either way, no crime to investigate further." The villagers seemed satisfied, grateful even, to have a neat conclusion. Madame Morel sagged into a chair, pressing a hand to her brow. Yvette stared at the floor, her face unreadable. Miss Marple, however, sat perfectly still. There was relief in the room, but it had a hollow quality, like a church bell ringing off-key. Too many things still hung loose. The storeroom theft, the Queen of Spades, the broken crucifix. That night, the boarding-house quieted earlier than usual. The guests retired, the fire burned low, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the old beams in the wind. Miss Marple remained in the parlour, knitting by lamplight, thinking about the letter. If it had truly been written before Father Benoit's disappearance, why had Madame Morel not mentioned it when she told her of the earlier letter? Why had this one survived the river when the other had been burnt immediately? And if Benoit had truly gone to meet his fate voluntarily, why would he have locked his door from the inside and left such peculiar tokens behind? The next morning, Duval returned to collect his things from the boarding-house. He was already speaking of his report to Paris, full of the smug assurance of a man who considered the business finished. But Miss Marple could not resist a final question. "Sergeant, in your search along the riverbank, did you find any of the missing food from the storeroom?" He frowned. "Food? What food?" "The bread, cheese, wine, taken from Madame Morel's storeroom 2 nights ago." Duval shook his head. "Number why?" "Because," Miss Marple said softly, "if Father Benoit had run away in the night, surely he would have taken some sustenance with him." The sergeant shrugged. "Perhaps he bought some along the way." "In the middle of the night," Miss Marple said, "in a village where no shops are open." Her tone was mild, but the point landed. Duval's brow furrowed, if only for a moment, before he dismissed it with a grunt and took his leave. That afternoon the mood in the house shifted again. Without the police present, the air seemed lighter, though not entirely free. Madame Morel busied herself in the kitchen, but Miss Marple noticed she kept glancing toward the back door as though expecting someone. Yvette was more subdued than usual, her tasks performed silently. Bouchard, however, was in good spirits, humming as he read a newspaper. It was while Miss Marple passed through the hall that she caught a fragment of whispered conversation, Yvette's voice, tense, and Madame Morel's, low and urgent. "He says it's over," Yvette whispered. "It is not over," Madame Morel replied sharply. "Not until we are sure." Miss Marple paused at the corner, her heart giving the smallest flutter. The false victory had settled over the village like a blanket, but beneath it, the embers still glowed. Whoever had orchestrated the real events had not finished their work, and might in fact feel emboldened by the police's withdrawal. And Miss Marple, for all her quiet manners, knew that a cornered mind could be far more dangerous when it believed itself safe. She resumed her knitting by the fire, but her mind was already moving toward the next step, to unravel the truth quietly before the real culprit struck again. The rain had not returned, but the air felt thick, as though the village itself were holding its breath. The police had gone, the case neatly filed away in their ledgers, and yet Miss Marple's instincts, honed over decades of watching human nature betray itself, told her the story was far from over. The stillness that had settled over Madame Morel's boarding house was not the stillness of peace, but of tension suppressed. It was an old habit of hers in such moments to turn her attention backward. People were forever looking to the present for answers, but Miss Marple knew that trouble often germinated long before it bore fruit. And there was something about this affair, the locked room, the broken crucifix, the Queen of Spades, that did not feel like a quarrel born yesterday. Her first clue came from the smallest of triggers. While dusting the parlour bookshelf that morning, Yvette knocked over a slim, leather-bound volume. Miss Marple, seated nearby, stooped to pick it up. It was not a novel at all, but an old parish ledger, kept, it seemed, in Father Benoit's neat hand. "You may put it on the side table, mademoiselle," Yvette said too quickly, reaching as though to snatch it away. But Miss Marple, with a mild smile, had already opened the first page. The ledger listed baptisms, weddings, and funerals, but it was in the back, scribbled notes in a different, sharper hand that her attention caught. Names, dates, and one name repeated more than once over several years, Armand Bouchard. Next to the most recent entry, 6 months old, was a note, confession refused, matter unresolved. She closed the book without comment, but inside her mind a spark had caught. A priest refusing confession was no small thing. It suggested not only a grave sin, but one that had gone unrepented, or perhaps unpunished. And Bouchard had been in the village far longer than he let on. That afternoon, while the others were occupied, Miss Marple took a walk through the village to pay a casual visit to the presbytery. The young curate, left in charge during Benoit's absence, was eager to talk. He confirmed what the ledger implied. Bouchard had lived in Saint-Martin-de-Rivière years ago, before leaving suddenly after a dispute with the parish. The matter, the curate said delicately, had involved money missing from a church fund and whispers of an affair with a married parishioner. The name of that parishioner made Miss Marple pause. Hélène Morel. Walking back to the boarding house, she allowed the past to unfurl before her like an old, half-forgotten photograph. Madame Morel, younger then, married to a man still living. Bouchard, ambitious and charming, making himself useful in village affairs. Money gone missing. A scandal that somehow never reached the light of day. And a priest, Benoit, caught in the middle, bound by confessional secrecy, yet unwilling to be a silent accomplice. The Queen of Spades began to take on a new shape in her mind. Not just a gambler's flourish, but a symbol, perhaps a private signal between two people who shared a dangerous past. Back at the boarding house, she watched them with new eyes. Madame Morel avoided Bouchard's gaze, not from dislike, but from a wariness that came from knowing too much. Yvette's loyalty made more sense as well. If she was Madame Morel's confidant, she might be protecting her employer from the consequences of old sins. And Etienne, who had no reason to be part of that older story, might simply have been drawn in by proximity, or perhaps through errands carried out without understanding their meaning. That evening, Miss Marple found Bouchard alone in the parlour, sipping wine. She approached with her knitting bag in hand. "You must have found it strange, returning to a village you knew so well," she said casually. His smile froze for a fraction of a second. "I have been many places. I do not dwell on the past. And yet the past," she said gently, "has a way of dwelling on us." He looked at her sharply, but she had already turned the conversation to harmless talk of the weather. The point had been made. She had seen the flicker in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. That night she heard voices in the kitchen, low, tense. Through the half-open door she saw Madame Morel and Bouchard standing close, their faces hard with old grievances. "You swore it was over," Bouchard hissed. "It was, until he brought it back," Madame Morel replied, her voice trembling. Miss Marple moved away before they could notice her, but her mind was racing. He could only mean Father Benoit. And if Benoit had tried to expose something from years ago, the motive for silencing him was no longer a matter of present convenience. It was about keeping buried a scandal that could ruin reputations even now. The locked room, the crucifix, the card, they were all part of a message, not just to Benoit, but to anyone else who might pry into the past. A warning steeped in old betrayals, meant to silence for good. The false victory of the previous day seemed more dangerous than ever. With the police gone, those who had worked to keep the past hidden would feel safe again. Safe enough, perhaps, to finish what they had started. And Miss Marple, for all her calm exterior, knew she would have to act quickly. The next move would belong to the one who feared the past most. Miss Marple rose early the next morning, moving about the boarding house with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew how to be invisible. She had decided in the night that the time for passive observation was over. If the truth lay buried beneath years of half-forgotten sins, she would have to dig, but not with blunt questioning, which only made liars choose their words more carefully. No, she would have to nudge the guilty hand until it betrayed itself. Her plan began with a visit to the church. The curate was startled to see her, but when she explained that she wished to return the old parish ledger to its proper place, he welcomed her in. While he busied himself in the sacristy, she leafed once more through the back pages, memorizing every date and margin note related to Armand Bouchard and Madame Morel. Then she slipped a small scrap of paper between two pages, her own handwritten note. "The past will speak again sooner than you think." When she returned to the boarding house, she left the ledger conspicuously on the sitting-room table where Bouchard often lingered. Then she settled herself in the corner armchair with her knitting, all the appearance of a harmless old lady, and waited. It was not long before Bouchard entered, whistling faintly. His gaze landed on the ledger. The whistle stopped. He picked it up, flicked through the pages, then froze at the inserted note. The change was subtle, a tightening of the shoulders, a slight paling of the face. But Miss Marple, who had seen criminals mask terror with smiles, recognized the flash of panic beneath the composed exterior. "You've found something interesting, Monsieur Bouchard?" she asked without looking up from her needles. "Only the dusty affairs of a parish," he said too quickly, tucking the book under his arm. "Nothing worth troubling over." She let the matter drop, but she had seen enough. The note had been a bluff. There was no new revelation yet, but his reaction told her there was indeed something in those records that he feared being brought to light. Her next move was a different sort of trick, one she had used once before in a village dispute over a will. At luncheon, she steered the conversation towards superstitions and omens, telling a rather grisly story about a card player in St. Mary Mead who had been haunted by the appearance of the Queen of Spades before his sudden death. She described how, in that tale, the card was found not just in his pocket but hidden in the lining of his coat, as though it had been placed there without his knowing. A warning, you see, that he could not ignore. As she spoke, her eyes were not on the table at large, but on the faces of those around it. Madame Morel stirred her soup with a slow, measured motion, her gaze fixed on the bowl. Etienne looked faintly, amused as though the story were an overlong joke. But Bouchard, his spoon clinked against the bowl, his hand trembling just slightly, the muscles in his jaw working as he forced a smile. When the meal was over, Miss Marple excused herself, went to her room, and quietly pinned a small paper Queen of Spades, cut from an old deck, inside the lining of Bouchard's coat, which hung in the hall. It was, of course, entirely harmless. But she had learned that the guilty often betray themselves most when they believe fate has turned against them. That evening, when Bouchard prepared to go out for his usual walk, he discovered it. She heard the sharp intake of breath from the hallway, followed by the faintest muttered curse in French, then the sound of him fumbling with the lining, tearing at the stitch to remove the card. The next morning, Yvette, looking flustered, announced that Monsieur Bouchard had decided to cut short his stay and would be leaving within the day. "Such a shame," Miss Marple said mildly. But inside she knew this was as good as a confession. An innocent man might be puzzled by a playing card turning up unexpectedly. A guilty one saw it as a sign that his secret was no longer safe. She wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. But now she knew two things for certain. First, that the Queen of Spades was not a random flourish, but a calculated emblem meant to frighten or threaten. And second, that Bouchard feared it as much as Father Benoit had. Before he could leave, she planned one more small test, the kind that revealed character when nothing else would. She asked Yvette, in a voice loud enough for him to overhear, to fetch a small parcel from the post office addressed to Madame M. CEO, the boarding house. In truth, the parcel contained nothing but old tea towels wrapped in brown paper. But on its label, in a hand Miss Marple had carefully imitated, she had written, "Armand, we must talk about what happened before." When the parcel arrived, she left it unattended on the hall table. Within minutes, Bouchard emerged from his room, glanced around, and, thinking himself unobserved, picked it up. His hands worked at the string, his eyes narrowing as he read the words. Then, hearing footsteps, he hastily rewrapped it and returned it to its place. Miss Marple had been watching from the doorway all along. She smiled to herself. The trap was not yet sprung, but the bird was fluttering. One more prod, and the mask would crack. Miss Marple awoke to the muffled sound of voices in the hallway. A low, urgent conversation cut short the moment a floorboard creaked under her slipper. By the time she stepped into the corridor, it was empty, save for the faint smell of damp wool and cigar smoke. Downstairs, the day had the brittle chill of a morning about to break bad news. Yvette was in the sitting room, wringing her hands over the now empty space on the sideboard. "It's gone, mademoiselle," she said. "The ledger, the parish ledger you brought here, it's vanished." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around the teacup she was holding. She had anticipated someone wanting the ledger gone. She had not expected them to be bold enough to take it from under so many noses. "When did you last see it?" "Late last night, after supper. Monsieur Bouchard was reading by the fire, but I swear he did not touch it. Then Madame Morel came in, said she was feeling cold, and shut the windows. I locked the doors before bed, as always. This morning, nothing." The police were summoned, but their arrival brought no comfort. Inspector Duval's tone carried the faint condescension reserved for helpful amateurs. "Perhaps, Mademoiselle Marple, you mislaid it." She ignored that. "And the lock on the front door?" "Untouched," Duval said, almost with satisfaction. "No signs of forced entry. If the book was stolen, the culprit was already in the house." It was a calculated statement, meant to narrow suspicion and to sow distrust. Miss Marple noted how quickly eyes shifted among the boarders. Madame Morel's gaze lingered a fraction too long on Yvette, who flushed. Etienne shrugged, muttering about overreaction. Bouchard kept his face unreadable, but his hands folded on his lap were rigid. Later, when the others drifted away, Yvette leaned close. "Mademoiselle, there is something I should tell you." Her voice trembled. "Last night, I heard someone moving in the sitting room after midnight. I thought it was you, but when I peeked from my door I saw a shadow. Tall, broad, not yours." "Did they see you?" But she bit her lip. "I heard the paper tear, as if someone were removing a page from the book. So it was not simply theft, it was alteration. Someone hadn't wanted to destroy the ledger entirely, they had wanted to edit history." That evening, Miss Marple pretended to be absorbed in a letter while the boarders gathered by the fire. A sharp wind rattled the shutters, and the talk turned to old scandals, how the last mayor had vanished abroad, how the jeweller's wife once ran off with a travelling peddler. It was idle chatter, but she noticed Bouchard's particular stillness, when Etienne mentioned a long-ago case of forged church records that had cost a curate his position. His gaze flickered, just for an instant, toward Madame Morel. When the others retired, Miss Marple slipped to the sitting room. She searched not for the missing ledger, but for remnants, a scrap of torn paper, a stray thread from the binding, a corner overlooked. In the narrow gap between the sideboard and the wall she found it, a small triangular scrap with part of a handwritten date and the loop of a capital letter. She slid it into her knitting bag before anyone could appear, but her quiet triumph soured by morning. The scrap was gone. Her knitting bag still hung on the back of her chair, but the yarn was tangled, the needles shifted. Someone had been in her room. She told no one. If the thief knew she'd noticed, they might take greater risks or become violent. Instead, she began to watch for smaller betrayals. A door closed too softly, a glance exchanged in silence, a sudden change of plans. By the third day, the tension was like a wire pulled taut. Madame Morel no longer joined meals. She claimed a headache and stayed in her room. Etienne took long walks at odd hours, returning with his pockets empty but his coat smelling faintly of tobacco not sold in the village. And Bouchard seemed oddly at ease, as if the weight that had been pressing on him had lifted. Miss Marple understood why. Without the ledger, or the damning page, it would be harder for the police to prove anything. And yet, she reminded herself, destroying the evidence didn't erase the truth. It merely meant she would have to make the truth speak without it. It was the third night since the ledger vanished, and the air in Madame Morel's boarding house was thick with the kind of silence that comes before a thunderstorm. Miss Marple, sitting by her window, watched the wind worry the shutters until one banged loose. Somewhere down the hall a floorboard groaned under deliberate weight. She rose, shawl around her shoulders, and eased her door open. The corridor was dark except for a faint line of light under the study door. That was unusual. Madame Morel had locked the study after supper, claiming her head still pounded. Miss Marple padded quietly toward it, but before she could knock, the light winked out. A heartbeat later, the door burst open and a figure darted past, nearly knocking her into the wall. By the time she caught her breath, the hall was empty again. She was about to call out when a strangled cry echoed from downstairs. They found Etienne in the small courtyard, sprawled beside the garden bench. His coat was half-buttoned, as though he'd been interrupted mid-preparation to leave. His face was turned toward the fountain, eyes glassy, lips pale. Inspector Duval knelt beside him and pronounced the obvious. Dead. No blood. No sign of a struggle. Just the sharp, acrid scent of something chemical hanging faintly in the air. Poison, Duval muttered. Fast acting. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. The household erupted in overlapping accusations. Madame Morel insisted Etienne had enemies from his days in Paris, though she refused to elaborate. Yvette swore she'd seen him pacing in the courtyard an hour earlier, talking to someone she couldn't make out. Bouchard, quiet as always, merely said, "He knew something. That's why he's dead." Miss Marple noticed something none of them seemed to. Etienne's right hand was clenched around a crumpled scrap of paper. Duval took it, unfolded it, and frowned. It was a train schedule, the earliest departure from the village to Marseille marked with a cross. In the margin, written hastily, were 3 words, "Before they know." Duval immediately leapt to conclusions. He was about to flee. Someone stopped him. Miss Marple didn't correct him, but her mind was working in careful loops. The timing was all wrong. If Etienne had intended to leave, why not wait until morning? And why poison him outside where anyone might see? That night, she could not sleep. She sat in the sitting room, the ticking of the mantel clock sounding louder than usual. When the clock struck 2, she heard it again, the soft creak of a stair, the whisper of fabric against plaster. She stayed perfectly still as the figure moved past the doorway toward the back of the house. Only after the faint sound of a latch lifting did she rise and follow. She reached the kitchen just in time to see the back door swing shut. Outside, the wind carried the smell of damp earth and something sharper, metallic. She followed it around the side of the house where the shadow of the shed loomed against the moonlight. The door stood ajar. Inside, a lantern flickered over open crates, bits of rope and, most damningly, a tin marked with the name of a rare pesticide banned for its toxicity. Before she could retreat, the lantern swung violently and went out. Something slammed into her shoulder, sending her stumbling into a stack of crates. She hit the ground hard, the breath driven from her lungs. By the time she recovered, she could hear only retreating footsteps and the soft thud of the shed door closing. The attack had not been meant to kill her. If it had, she wouldn't be breathing. No, this had been a warning. By dawn, the entire boarding house was under lock and key. Duval posted a constable at each exit, convinced the killer would try to escape. But Miss Marple knew better. The killer wasn't running. Not yet. They were still here, waiting for the next move, and she had just made herself the next target. She thought of Etienne's train schedule, of the missing ledger, of the faint trace of chemical in the courtyard. The threads were tightening, but they didn't yet form a complete picture. All she knew was this: whoever had killed Etienne had been in that shed before and had left something behind, and if she could find it before the killer struck again, the game might finally shift in her favour. The morning after Etienne's death broke grey and damp, the village smothered in a mist that dulled every sound. Inside Madame Morel's boarding house, the air was taut as wire. Conversations stopped abruptly when Miss Marple entered a room, and footsteps echoed down the hallways with the hesitance of people listening for danger. She had spent much of the early morning in the shed, ostensibly helping Duval's men search, though in truth they were in her way. Most were content to glance into the open crates and move on, but Miss Marple lingered over the little things: scraps of twine, a broken mug, a line of dust disturbed in a neat arc on one high shelf. It was that arc of dust that she filed away in her mind. Something had been there recently, something small enough to be lifted without disturbing the surrounding clutter. A bottle, perhaps. She returned to the study, where Duval was cross-questioning Madame Morel again. "You said you locked this room every night," Duval said. "Yet 2 nights ago someone was in here after hours." Madame Morel clutched her silk scarf as if it were armour. "I always lock it. If it was open, it was not by my doing." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the writing desk. The ledger was still missing, of course, but what drew her attention was the ink blotter. It had been rotated since she last saw it, and the paper tucked beneath it, a simple note from the grocer, now bore a faint, mirrored imprint. She bent slightly, peering closer. "Curious," she murmured. The imprint was part of a sentence: "Deliver before nightfall." It was in a different hand than the grocer's tidy script. This was hurried, looping, the sort of writing done when one eye is on the door. She didn't need the rest of the sentence to know it connected to Etienne's "before they know" message, but it was an offhand comment at breakfast that solidified the shape forming in her mind. Yvette, fussing over her teacup, remarked to Bouchard, "You always stir your tea counterclockwise. I've never seen anyone do that before." Bouchard smiled thinly. "Old habit from my grandmother. She said it cooled the tea faster." Most people laughed, but Miss Marple's mind pricked. The night of Etienne's death, she had seen Bouchard in the parlour, stirring his brandy, an odd thing to do, since brandy needed no stirring. He had used a small silver spoon, dipping it only briefly before setting it down with exaggerated care. Now she understood. The stirring was not about cooling at all. It was about mixing. She excused herself, moving quietly to the small sideboard in the parlour where the spoons were kept. They were all there except one. She opened the drawer beneath, and there it was, polished clean, but faintly smelling of something sharp and acrid when she brought it close to her nose. The pattern began to arrange itself neatly in her thoughts. The ledger vanished. Etienne prepared to leave, holding the knowledge of what was inside it. Someone panicked, slipped poison into his drink and made it look like a hurried departure gone wrong. But the poison wasn't from a convenient bottle in the kitchen. It was that banned pesticide from the shed, transferred in minute amounts via something innocuous. Like a spoon. Her eyes drifted toward the window, to the garden where the fountain gurgled quietly. She remembered the faint metallic tang in the air that night. Someone had rinsed the spoon there before returning it to the sideboard. And there was one more thing, small, almost laughably so, but now glaring in its significance. The pesticide tin in the bay. She'd had been placed on a low shelf. All the other chemicals were kept higher, well out of reach of Madame Morel's short frame or Yvette's delicate arms. The one person tall enough to reach the higher shelves without stretching, and therefore needing to stoop to reach the low one, was Bouchard. She sat back, her tea cooling in her hands. The ledger, the poisoned drink, the deliberate misdirection with the train schedule, it all pointed in one direction. The thing to do now was not to accuse, but to let the pattern fully expose itself. She would have to watch Bouchard very carefully and wait for him to make the one mistake that would let her pull the entire web into the light. And if she was correct, that mistake would come very soon indeed. The mist clung stubbornly to the village that evening, muffling the world in a damp silence that seemed to press against the windows of Madame Morel's boarding house. Miss Marple sat in the lounge, knitting in her lap, her eyes half on the fire, half on the slow, deliberate movements of Inspector Bouchard as he poured himself a drink. He did it as if nothing in the world were amiss, precisely the sort of calm a guilty man cultivated when he knew others were watching. She let her mind wander back over the past days. Everyone had assumed the motive was financial. The ledger, after all, was proof enough of Madame Morel's illicit dealings with certain political factions. But the more she considered the peculiarities of the case, the less that explanation satisfied her. Why kill Etienne for a ledger when the same result could have been achieved by simply stealing it outright? And why use poison, a method slow enough to allow for possible intervention, when Bouchard had the means to make Etienne's death appear far more accidental? The answer had to lie deeper than money. She remembered the way Bouchard had reacted, so subtly she doubted anyone else noticed, when Madame Morel had mentioned Etienne's plans to go to Paris to meet someone important. A slight tightening of the jaw, a quick blink, a momentary shift of weight from one foot to the other. It was not fear of exposure, it was something more personal. The breakthrough came in the form of a conversation overheard by accident. Yvette, unaware Miss Marple had paused just outside the kitchen, was speaking to the maid in a hushed but urgent tone. He should never have come back here, not after what happened all those years ago. Bouchard warned him. He warned him. Years ago. The past, Miss Marple knew, had a way of clinging to people far more stubbornly than they liked to admit. She thought of the missing ledger again, not as financial evidence, but perhaps as something else entirely. What if it contained not just names and numbers, but records of events long buried, events in which Bouchard himself had played a part? Her suspicion was confirmed later that night, when she took a quiet stroll to the back garden under the pretext of checking the frost on Madame Morel's roses. There, in the damp soil near the garden wall, she noticed a scrap of paper caught beneath a stone. She prized it free and smoothed it under the faint light from the kitchen window. The handwriting was the same looping script as the note under the blotter. It was not an order for supplies. It was part of a confession, written, then apparently torn up and discarded. Could not let him speak. If they knew about the child, it would ruin everything. The child? Miss Marple's breath caught, and for a moment she felt the deep, sorrowful weight that came when a puzzle's answer was darker than expected. The motive was not greed. It was blood. Etienne, she realized, had known about a child born in secret nearly 2 decades earlier, the product of a liaison between Bouchard and Madame Morel's late sister. At the time, the sister had been engaged to a prominent figure whose reputation could not withstand the scandal. The child had been quietly adopted abroad, but records of the arrangement, along with names, dates, and the identity of the adoptive family, had been kept in the ledger for safekeeping. Bouchard had spent years burying that part of his life, building his career on the image of a principled man. But if Etienne had met the now-grown child or intended to bring him, or her, back into the fold, the truth would have shattered everything: his position, his standing in the community, his marriage. That was the true reason for the murder. The ledger was merely a convenient scapegoat, a way to disguise a crime of desperate personal fear as one of cold financial calculation. Miss Marple, still holding the damp scrap of paper, looked toward the glow of the lounge windows. Bouchard sat inside, apparently at ease, laughing softly with Duval over some minor detail of the case. But she saw him differently now, a man who had killed not for gain, but to protect the fragile, brittle shell of a life built on lies. It explained the choice of poison: silent, intimate, a method that allowed him to control the exact moment of Etienne's death. It explained the elaborate misdirection with the shed and the train schedule, and it explained the almost imperceptible flicker of something, regret perhaps, that passed over his face whenever Etienne's name was mentioned. In her experience, the most dangerous motives were not born from greed or ambition, but from the terror of losing the thing one could not bear to live without. She slipped the scrap into her pocket. The time for quiet observation was drawing to an end. She knew now not just who had killed Etienne, but why. And she also knew that a man who had killed once to keep a secret would do so again if he sensed the truth edging toward daylight. The next move would have to be hers. The wind howled down the narrow streets of Saint-Just that night, rattling shutters and tugging at the ancient eaves of Madame Morel's boarding house. Inside, the lounge glowed with lamplight, the fire crackling low, its warmth at odds with the icy tension settling over the room. Miss Marple sat in her usual armchair, a ball of pale blue wool in her lap, needles clicking in quiet rhythm. Across from her, Inspector Bouchard leaned back in a leather chair, swirling a brandy in his hand. His expression was one of casual curiosity, though his eyes tracked her in that careful way of men who sense danger but can't quite place it. "I was thinking," she began, her tone mild, conversational, "about how very strange it is when a crime seems at first to be about one thing, and yet, upon closer inspection, turns out to be about something entirely different. It's a bit like knitting, you see. What looks like a simple scarf may turn out to be a rather complicated sleeve." Bouchard smiled thinly. "And which am I, madame?" "Scarf or sleeve?" "Oh, I wouldn't like to say," she replied, eyes fixed on her work. "But I have noticed that when people knit in the round, when they keep their business in the family, as it were, it is much harder to spot the joins." She looked up at him then, just long enough to see the smallest flicker of tension cross his face. Madame Morel entered with a tray of tea, her hands trembling only slightly as she set it down. She too avoided looking directly at Bouchard. Miss Marple had taken her aside earlier, whispering something that had made the older woman blanch. "I think we should have everyone in here," Miss Marple said softly but firmly. "Yvette, Monsieur Duval, even young Henri from the stables. It is rather cold tonight, and there's something to be said for the warmth of company." Within minutes the lounge was crowded. Yvette perched on the edge of a chair, Duval stood stiffly near the mantel, and Henri fidgeted by the door. Bouchard looked from one to the other, his calm beginning to crack under the strain of so many eyes. "Why this little gathering, Miss Marple?" he asked lightly. "Are we to have another round of theories?" "Not theories, Inspector. Conclusions." The room seemed to draw in on itself. Even the fire quieted, its popping embers subdued. Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and drew out a scrap of paper, still faintly damp from where she had found it in the garden. "This," she said, her voice carrying an unexpected firmness, "is a fragment of something you wrote. It was meant to be destroyed, but the earth doesn't keep secrets as well as people imagine. I dare say you thought no one would notice the missing piece from the letter you tore up. But you see, Inspector, I notice the small things. Always have." Bouchard's gaze dropped to the paper. His jaw tightened. "It says," she continued, "that you could not let him speak. That if they knew about the child, it would ruin everything. That child, Inspector, is not some vague invention of mine. I think you know exactly where they are, and exactly how Etienne came to know the truth." Yvette's hand flew to her mouth. Duval shifted uneasily. "You killed him," Miss Marple said plainly now. "Not for the ledger, though that served as a useful excuse, but because Etienne had found the one truth you could never allow into the light." Bouchard's voice was calm, but a vein pulsed in his temple. "And what proof do you have of this theory?" "More than you realize," she replied. "The ledger is no longer missing. Madame Morel found it where you'd hidden it in the false back of your desk. I have read it, every entry, including the ones in your own handwriting, the arrangement with the adoptive family, the payments, the names of the intermediaries. It is all there." The room was utterly still. The only sound was the faint creak of the wind pressing against the shutters. Bouchard set down his brandy with exaggerated care. His eyes swept the room, measuring each face. "So," he said softly, You would ruin me over a scrap of paper and an old mistake. No, Miss Marple said, meeting his gaze steadily. You ruined yourself the moment you put poison in that man's drink. Something shifted in him then, a subtle, dangerous loosening of restraint. His hand twitched toward the inside of his coat. Duval noticed and moved, stepping forward, but Bouchard was faster, producing not a pistol but a small knife from the inner pocket. You think you can corner me like a rat, old woman? His voice was low, almost conversational, but his eyes burned. Miss Marple didn't flinch. You will find, Inspector, that I am very good at catching rats. And unlike the police, I have no need to shout about it. The gendarmerie are waiting just outside. They will have heard everything. For a fraction of a second, disbelief flashed across his face. Then the sound of boots in the corridor told him she spoke the truth. His shoulders sagged, not in surrender, but in the bone-deep weariness of a man whose lies have finally given way under their own weight. When the door burst open and the officers entered, Bouchard did not resist. He handed over the knife and allowed himself to be led away. His head bowed. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles resuming their steady click. Funny thing about secrets, she murmured to no one in particular. They do so like to come out in the end, especially when one tugs at the right loose thread. And in the silence that followed, the wind finally dropped, as if the whole village had exhaled at last. The morning after Inspector Bouchard's arrest dawned cold and grey, the mist from the river curling along the cobblestones like ghostly fingers. Saint-Just, though still buzzing with gossip, seemed to have settled into a quiet sense of closure. At Madame Morel's boarding-house, Miss Marple sat in the breakfast-room with a pot of tea, the local paper folded neatly beside her. The headline, Inspector Bouchard charged in Etienne's murder, was printed in bold letters. Beneath it, the article neatly summarized the case, the motive, the evidence, the confession by implication. It read, Miss Marple thought, as if the entire business had been wrapped up with a bow. She sipped her tea, her mind oddly restless. Most cases left her with a quiet satisfaction. This one did not. The door to the breakfast-room creaked open. Yvette slipped in, eyes red-rimmed, her hands wrapped around herself. "I thought you'd gone, mademoiselle," she said softly. "I shall," Miss Marple replied, "once the trains are running on time again. But there is something unfinished." Yvette sank into a chair opposite her. "They say he will hang, but you do not seem pleased." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, twice. "My dear, justice is never something to be pleased about. One should only be relieved. Yet I am not relieved." Before Yvette could respond, the front door banged open. Henri, the stable boy, burst in, his cheeks flushed from the cold. "Madame! Mademoiselle! There's something in the police cart!" He gestured wildly toward the street. Miss Marple rose, her joints protesting, and followed Henri outside. There, tied to the back of the cart used to transport Bouchard the previous night, was a small leather satchel. It hadn't been there before. The gendarme on duty frowned. "We found it this morning. Locked. No one knows whose it is." Miss Marple's gaze narrowed. The satchel's leather was scuffed in a familiar way, the handle reinforced with an oddly mismatched stitch, one she had noticed in the boarding-house hallway only yesterday. "This," she said quietly, "belongs to Duval." The gendarme looked uncertain. "Monsieur Duval? But he's the one who helped us arrest Bouchard." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "He did help. Perhaps rather too helpfully." The satchel's lock was flimsy, and with a hairpin from her sleeve she snapped it open. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, along with a stack of banknotes and a gold signet ring engraved with the crest of the Davranche family, Etienne's employers. Henri's eyes went wide. "That ring! It went missing months ago." Miss Marple sifted through the letters. Each was addressed to mon cher frère, my dear brother, and signed Y. The handwriting was Yvette's. She glanced up at Yvette, who had followed them outside. The young woman had gone pale, her lips parting soundlessly. "You wrote to him," Miss Marple said gently, and Duval kept the letters, but not out of sentiment. These letters speak of things that, if public, would have destroyed Etienne's reputation, and Duval knew how to use such things. The gendarme's frown deepened. Are you saying Duval? I am saying, Miss Marple cut in, that Duval blackmailed both Etienne and Bouchard. He played them against each other. When Etienne finally refused to pay, Duval saw an opportunity, frame Bouchard by letting his long-buried scandal surface and remove a troublesome debtor in one stroke. Yvette shook her head. But Bouchard confessed. No, Miss Marple said quietly. He never confessed. He merely didn't deny what everyone was ready to believe. Pride will make a man accept guilt for one crime to keep another hidden. The gendarme shifted uneasily. Then Bouchard didn't kill Etienne? Miss Marple shook her head, her eyes on the satchel. Number Duval poisoned the drink, knowing suspicion would fall on Bouchard once the ledger was found. And I dare say Duval meant for that ledger to be found, just not by me quite so soon. A shadow fell over them. Duval himself had appeared at the corner, his posture too casual for a man who'd supposedly been helping the police tie up loose ends. His eyes landed on the open satchel, and for a fraction of a second his composure cracked. "Looking through my things, Miss Marple?" he asked smoothly. "Only what you left behind," she replied. "You really should be more careful where you hide the evidence of murder." The gendarme stepped forward, but Duval's hand twitched toward his coat pocket. Miss Marple's voice, sharp and sudden, cut through the air. "Don't." It wasn't a plea, it was a command. Perhaps it was the certainty in her voice, or the realization that his game was truly over, but Duval's hand stilled. The gendarme moved in, seizing his arm and pulling a small pistol from his coat. As they led Duval away, Yvette's knees buckled and Miss Marple caught her arm. "He used you, my dear, but you need not bear his guilt." Yvette's tears fell freely now. "I thought it was over. I thought Bouchard was the end of it." Miss Marple patted her hand. "With human wickedness there is rarely just one end, only the end we can reach." That night, as she packed her suitcase, Miss Marple reflected on the strange turn the case had taken. Bouchard, though far from innocent in life, was not guilty of the one crime that mattered most. And Duval, ever the polite gentleman, had proven that the most dangerous snakes often slithered closest to the hearth. When her train pulled away from Saint-Just the next morning, the mist was lifting. Yet she knew that in some dark corner of the village, someone was already whispering a new story, one where the truth would twist again in the telling. The courtroom in Saint-Just was small, almost intimate, more like a chapel than a hall of justice. Morning sunlight streamed through tall, dusty windows, painting pale stripes across the faces of the townspeople who had come to watch the trial. They had heard whispers of the truth, but most still struggled to believe it. At the defence table, Inspector Bouchard sat stiffly, his jaw tight. He looked thinner than Miss Marple remembered, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a reluctant gratitude. Across the room, Duval lounged in his chair, his fine suit immaculate, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth as if the whole affair bored him. The gavel struck once, and the proceedings began. Miss Marple was called as the final witness. She walked to the stand with her usual unhurried grace, her hands folded before her. The prosecutor, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers, cleared his throat. "Miss Marple," he began, "would you please explain to the court how you came to suspect Monsieur Duval of the murder of Etienne Morel?" She inclined her head politely. "It was not one single thing, monsieur, but rather the accumulation of small ones. Murderers, you see, rarely commit their crime without leaving behind a pattern. One must simply know how to look." The room leaned in, the air taut with curiosity. "I first noted Duval's peculiar eagerness to aid the investigation," Miss Marple continued. "True helpfulness is quiet and steady. His was theatrical, always arriving with just the right piece of gossip or pointing me toward the next clue, as though he were guiding me through a garden path. It is often the guide, you know, who decides what the traveller sees." Her eyes flicked briefly to Duval. His smirk faltered. "Then there was the satchel," she said. "When I first saw it in the hallway of the boarding house, it was closed but faintly damp at the base, as though it had been placed briefly on wet stone. Later it appeared again, tied to the police cart. The leather bore a unique repair stitch, one I recognized instantly. Inside were the missing letters, the signet ring, and cash. Clear evidence of blackmail. The prosecutor nodded. But how did this connect him to the actual murder? Because, Miss Marple said, the poison used on Etienne was dissolved in a cordial, one only Duval had purchased that week, though he claimed otherwise. I recalled overhearing Madame Morel mention it was a rare variety, sold only at a particular shop in Rouen. Duval had, earlier in the week, boasted of a trip there. He likely thought the detail too trivial to recall, but I remembered. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Duval needed Etienne dead, she continued, because the young man had refused to pay further, but he also needed someone else to take the blame. Inspector Bouchard's past misdeeds provided a perfect scapegoat. By planting the incriminating ledger and fanning the flames of gossip, Duval ensured suspicion would cling to the inspector like smoke to cloth. The defense attorney rose. And yet, Mademoiselle Marple, this is largely circumstantial. Circumstantial, she interrupted mildly. Only if one ignores the final proof. When Duval saw the satchel opened, his first instinct was to reach for his pocket, where he kept the pistol. That was not the reaction of an innocent man surprised by a misunderstanding. It was the reflex of a cornered predator. There was a murmur through the courtroom. Duval shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. The prosecutor turned to the judge. "We rest our case, Your Honour." The verdict was delivered before noon. Duval, once the charming fixture of Saint-Just's soirée, was declared guilty. His face betrayed no shock, only a cool, assessing calculation, as if even now he were weighing his chances of escape. Bouchard, meanwhile, was formally cleared of the murder charge, but as the gavel fell for the last time, he did not meet Miss Marple's gaze. She suspected he was already thinking of the shadows still lurking in his career, the sins unrelated to this crime that would eventually catch up with him. Outside the courthouse, the winter air was crisp, the sun weak but steady. Villagers gathered in knots, discussing the verdict in rapid whispers. Yvette found Miss Marple near the steps. "It's over then," she said, though her voice held a question. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "For now." They walked together to the river, where the mist still lingered in low curls above the water. Yvette hesitated before speaking again. "You seemed so certain, even before you had the satchel. Was it really that obvious?" "Obvious," Miss Marple said gently, "is a word one uses when one has the answer in hand. Before that, it is only suspicion, shaped by years of watching people. A man who tells a lie often hides behind too much detail. A man who commits a crime hides behind too much helpfulness. Duval did both." Yvette lowered her gaze. "And what of Bouchard? He walks free." Miss Marple's tone was cool. "Freedom is not the same as innocence. He will find, I think, that a man cannot so easily outrun his past." They stood in silence, the river lapping gently against the embankment. Somewhere behind them, the clatter of hooves marked the departure of the prison cart carrying Duval away. Whether to a secure cell or to some future escape, Miss Marple could not say. Later that evening, as she packed her small suitcase once again, she reflected on the case. Justice, she thought, was rarely the tidy, satisfying thing people wished it to be. It was messy, imperfect, more often about preventing further harm than correcting the past. Duval had been caught, yes, but in her heart she suspected he would try again, in another place, under another name. Still, there was some comfort in knowing that for now, the people of Saint-Just could sleep without a serpent in their midst. She took up her knitting, the soft click of the needles marking the slow unwinding of the day. On the table beside her lay the satchel, now empty. The gendarme had returned it to her as thanks, though why she had kept it she couldn't quite say. Perhaps as a reminder that every neat stitch in the world, no matter how well done, could hide a fraying thread, and if that thread were ever to be pulled again, she would be there to follow it to the very end. The morning after Duval's conviction, Saint-Just seemed to breathe differently. The fog over the river was thinner, the cobbled streets quieter, as though the entire village had loosened its grip on some unspoken tension. Miss Marple, suitcase in hand, stepped out of the boarding house and took one last look at the narrow lanes, the clustered rooftops, the ivy-covered chimneys. She was not sentimental by nature, but there was something about Saint. Just that had lodged itself in her thoughts, a certain sharpness to the place, as though every stone and shutter had overheard more secrets than they cared to tell. Yvette appeared at the doorway. "The coach to the station leaves in 10 minutes, she said. Miss Marple nodded. "Plenty of time." They walked together toward the square, their shoes clicking against the damp stones. Market stalls were setting up, the vendors calling to one another with the cheer of people who had outlived the worst. But as they passed the baker's, Miss Marple noticed a folded scrap of paper tucked beneath the latch of the door. It was addressed in a precise, elegant hand, Mademoiselle Marple. She slipped it into her pocket without comment. At the square, Bouchard was waiting, hat in hand, eyes shadowed, but less hard than before. "You'll be missed here," he said. "I rather think the village will be glad to return to its usual gossip," she replied lightly. He hesitated. "Duval will not forgive you. If he escapes—" "Then," she said, "I shall have to be ready." They exchanged no further pleasantries. She boarded the coach, Yvette waving until the curve of the road swallowed her from view. It was only once the train was in motion, the countryside sliding past in shades of green and grey, that Miss Marple unfolded the note. The paper was thick, the ink fresh. A single line ran across it in that same elegant hand. What you took from Duval was only one piece of the game. A friend. She read it twice, her expression unchanged. Then slowly she reached into her handbag and withdrew the satchel, now empty, returned to her after the trial. She had inspected it thoroughly, or so she believed. But now, with the train swaying gently, she noticed the faintest irregularity along the inside seam, a patch where the stitching was newer, tighter. From her sewing kit, she took a small pair of embroidery scissors and worked the seam open. Out slid a narrow slip of parchment, brittle with age, covered in spidery writing. The language was archaic French, but she caught enough to understand. A list of names, dates, and a symbol she recognized from the ring Duval had once worn, a serpent eating its own tail. The last date was recent, very recent. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She had assumed Duval's motive was personal. Blackmail, greed, perhaps a dash of revenge. But this suggested something wider, older, and far more dangerous. The parchment was not just a remnant of this crime. It was a ledger of secrets yet unpaid. The train whistle blew, a long, mournful note. She folded the parchment carefully and returned it to her bag. When the porter came to check her ticket, she smiled pleasantly, as though nothing had disturbed her morning. Outside, the fields rolled past in a blur, the horizon beckoning with its quiet promise. Somewhere ahead lay her next destination, though she could not yet name it. Somewhere, perhaps already in motion, was the next move in this game Duval had hinted at, without even knowing the full extent himself. As the train crossed a narrow viaduct, she caught her reflection in the glass. A small, elderly woman in an unremarkable hat, knitting needles poking from her bag. Exactly the sort of person no one would suspect of carrying the key to a mystery that might stretch far beyond Saint-Just. She allowed herself the faintest of smiles. A mystery, after all, never truly ends.